All right, so welcome to This Week in WordPress in Higher Education. This is Jonathan Perlman from Dawson College in Montreal, and I'm joined by four people that are in higher ed. So let's do the round of introductions. Rachel, why don't you go first?
Hi, my name is Rachel Carden. I'm a web developer at the University of Alabama. Build lots of plugins and themes and stuff like that, and excited to talk about accessibility.
All right, thanks, Rachel. Let's go with the first mic of the two mics. Let's go the mic that's, I believe, None Canada.
Hi, I'm Michael Scofield from Not Canada. I am a front-end developer and a librarian in deep in South Florida, and also one of the WordCamp Miami organizers. Hello.
Okay, and now let's go with the mic that is in Canada.
Hi, I'm Mike 2 from Canada. I'm senior web developer at Carleton University in lovely Ottawa, Ontario.
And finally, Chris, but last but not least, Curtis Grimaldo.
Hi, I'm Mike 3, also known as Curtis, and I am at the University of Mary Washington in Virginia within the United States. I am a developer that deals primarily with WordPress, and we use WordPress for basically 100% of our public web-facing stuff here at UMW.
All right, cool. So today we're going to be talking about accessibility, and accessibility is a big thing because of the fact that as higher education institutions, we're actually mandated by various laws and various rules that we have to follow for accessibility, as we're going to be talking about. So let's start the chat. Like, why is accessibility such an important deal in 2016?
I'll take over. So basically, accessibility is just this principle and a practice that refers to removing barriers on your websites, and that can be a very broad definition, but basically removing barriers so that anyone can interact with your website no matter their disability. And so people that have visual impairments or physical impairments, a wide range, at a basic level, we all understand, most of the web people understand the need for alt attributes for images, but accessibility can go pretty far. It can include anything from color contrast, so that people with color blindness can understand your information, and then big things like having captions for videos, so that people that have hearing impairments can consume your information. And there are a wide array of things that we can test for and that we can practice on our websites to make sure that everyone can consume our content and our functionality. And so accessibility should be important just for those general reasons. We should want our information to be available to everyone. And data actually shows that 1 in 5 users to your website have some kind of disability. And so if your website is not accessible, no matter the content, you could be restricting access to 20% of your user base. But like Jonathan mentioned, in higher education, we have to go a step further, because if we receive federal funding, we are required by law to reach a certain level of standards. It may not necessarily be the level that we should probably even strive to go further than that. But in the U.S., we are required to reach Section 508 standards. There are also WCAG 2.0, which is the other general set of standards, and I know that Canada and our Canadian participants can kind of embellish on that a little bit more, but they have a different set of standards that I think goes even further than ours, which is great, and so we'll talk about that as well. But accessibility should be important to everyone, no matter if you're in higher education or not, but it's something that we do talk about a lot in our field.
I would also add, as you were talking about the importance of accessibility, that sometimes people refer to this as universal design, which I think is a slightly friendlier term. And what that means to broaden that term is that we're not just talking about people with, specific impairments or things like that, but for instance, captioning a video or making sure that there's a transcript available for a video. If you're sitting in a cubicle and you don't have headphones, you probably aren't going to be able to hear that video anyway. If you're in a house with noisy kids, you're not going to be able to hear that video, whether you have any impairments or recognized, issues that could keep you from hearing that. You still won't be able to hear it. So those captions are technology, regardless of how you look at it. And it's that universal design to make sure that everything within your web presence is available to everybody and consumable by everybody. So whether it's simply that you're in a noisy library or a Starbucks cafe without your headphones, or whether it's that you're partially deaf or fully deaf, it's a matter of making sure that anybody can consume that content.
That's a really good point, if I can jump in, that there was a post on the pastry box. I don't know if any of you are familiar with that. That goes back into 2014 by Ann Gibson, and I'll make sure we have the link so we can post it, called An Alphabet of Accessibility Issues, where basically it just hammers home the point that Curtis just made. There's also a tremendous point to be made to some of the cynics or developers out there who might not prioritize accessibility, which is going to be quite a lot of them, where accessibility really begins in good markup and semantic markup, where the nature of, like, for screen readers to be able to parse the information on the website is not dissimilar from the way that a crawl bot must parse the information on the website. The ability to navigate without a mouse, to navigate by keyboard only, these have tremendous impact just on the findability and discoverability of the content, especially in higher ed, where we might be trying to reach prospective students. Building accessibility into our design phase from the very beginning will have will make huge improvements, I guess, into our ability just to reach them. Our SEO will improve, etc. All that.
Yeah, that's a really good point. When I first started at Carleton, our themes were not accessible in any way. And then we have an act in Ontario, AODA, which requires us to meet certain accessibility guidelines by certain dates. So by January 1st, 2014, all of our web content needed to conform to WCAG 2.0 level A, and by 2021, it has to all conform to double A. And I was primarily a back-end developer, I learned so much just converting our theme to be WCAG 2.0A compliant. I learned so much about how to write good, proper markup. So, I mean, you can use that as an excuse to start learning accessibility standards if you want.
eBay has a really interesting, I think it's eBay, they have a really interesting rule set in how they force their developers to write accessible markup, in that they write CSS so that if an article section doesn't have like the role, or if a good one, if an image does not or has an empty alt attribute, the image just doesn't show, it's blank with a black box. So I don't know. So they just force their developers to comply through CSS rules, which is a really interesting strategy. It means you won't forget when you wonder why that image isn't showing. You're like, oh, I get it.
We have another incentive. AODA can actually fine the university $50,000
yes.
for every day that the accessibility error or it isn't corrected. But I mean, that can lead into training users as well, because we require an alt tag as a simple example on an image, but if your alt tag is "this is a photo," that doesn't really help very much, right? So
something that I've in higher ed we have there's just me. So my division is a good example. I'm the only web person, and we have like 21 departments and a portfolio of about 60 websites. And so I am dependent on, WordPress for this large kind of distributed editing. And, I have to put a lot of content into the hands of, people in these various departments. So then it's up to me to educate and to train, content managers not only on the importance or not only on what is accessibility, why it's important, but then how to evaluate and how to make sure our content's accessible, and I have to set up reporting and stuff like that. And there are a lot of tools that help in this regard, and we'll touch on a few of those. But so a lot of accessibility really is education and something that we have to work on, and not everyone even knows about it, or even knows to what extent it can kind of travel out to. I gave a presentation over the weekend at WordCamp Miami about evaluating accessibility, and the majority of it was, here are the tools, but I touched on the beginning of here are the big areas. And so I had several people come up to me and just say, I'd never even thought about that. I never thought about making sure that my links aren't just dependent on color, that they're underlined or they have something, because colorblind people can't tell that your text is a different color. They need more than that. So education is very important when it comes to accessibility.
And as part of education, what I try to do with my people, my users, my editors, is the fact that I don't tell them I'm making it accessible. What I'm doing is I'm telling them that we're helping the people read the content, consume the content. So I'm not really forcing the accessibility side of things, but like when people ask why is the text color green versus yellow? Well, the thing is, the green text might be easier to read on like a blue background, as an example. In fact, this happened to me in Miami. I was actually when I was at work in Miami over the weekend with Rachel and Michael. I was just looking at pages and whatnot, and surfing the web on my phone in the bright sun, and in some cases I could not read the content because of the fact that those web developers, chose to use like a gray text on a white background, and in the bright sun you're not going to read it, you're not going to be able to see it. Therefore, then at that point, on a screen, on a desktop screen, that text is fine, it's readable, but then when you take yourself into a different context, you're going to have problems. You're going to see different problems at that point.
Right, and it's a very valid point, and that goes back to kind of the concept of universal design, where you're not just making sure that the site has proper color contrast for those of us that are colorblind, but you're also making sure that, for instance, if somebody's got an old school monitor that's not showing the colors quite right, if somebody's got a phone in the bright sun, like you were saying, if somebody's viewing it on a TV, for instance, that may not display the colors quite the same. Not everybody, and especially when it comes to designers, they're typically designing on like one of the latest, Mac Thunderbolt displays that, looks gorgeous and has 18 billion colors and things like that. But not everybody that's consuming the content is going to be viewing it on that same kind of monitor. They may be viewing it on a monitor where the HDMI cable or the RGB cable or whatever they're using is a little messed up, and so everything's got a slight blue tint or something like that. So it's important, again, these things are being consumed on all kinds of devices with all kinds of color profiles, and so that contrast is important whether you're colorblind or not. People may simply not be able to even see your content, let alone be able to legibly read it if that contrast isn't sufficient.
Something else that I like to point out sometimes, it may not necessarily be a standard, but responsive web design is another factor to accessibility, in the sense that ensuring that your website looks, is readable and you can use it on a variety of devices, no matter the size. I mean, you could, for most of us, it just means looking nice on our cell phone, but what if you had an assistive device that was, some weird size that, no one ever thought about? If someone's site is truly responsive, then it would look just fine on their device. Also, something else to think about is download sizes. People that don't have access to high-speed internet, even in this day and age, there are a lot of people that have to use modems and 56K, all that kind of stuff. And if your site takes forever to download, that's information that they're going to miss out on. And so it's really important to be cognitive of that fact.
Right, and that those bandwidth speeds also speak to the importance of having alt attributes and stuff like that, because the image may never download because of the poor internet service. And I'll tell you, regarding the responsive design, there's a pet peeve of mine where people tend to adjust the font size as it gets smaller and smaller, as the device gets smaller and smaller, to the point where you can't magnify the text. And so I may zoom in because I can't read the text, but if you make the text smaller when I zoom in, that didn't help me at all. So be careful of that.
Responsive web design as an accessibility issue is going to open a huge can of worms, because talking about the bandwidth, the most responsive websites are also the heaviest websites. HTTP archive tracks just how even though the ubiquity of the internet is growing, the download speeds are slowing, because most internet is accessible or is accessed through a phone, but at the same time the size of the pages are growing as well. So so you run into people creating amazing designs and throwing in a whole bunch of attributes and features, where the reality is that it's not going to load in the first place because it's a 4 megabyte download. One thing to consider is that many of us, especially in the United States, who are either clinging to our unlimited data plans, are seeing a time where there is no longer unlimited data carrier plans, and we are, we're maxed. Maybe we're maxed out at 2 gigs or 3 gigs, but this is sort of the reality universally, where even large websites will not just be, I guess, inaccessible, if we're going to couch it in that term, but it's also going to literally cost people money because they're going to blow through their caps. So again, it's a huge can of worms, and it's very interesting to talk about. Because there's a lot of bad practice with responsive web design.
When you speak about speeds, there's actually a good tool in Google Developer Tools that can actually throttle the network. At that point, you can then put yourself in a mode where you're actually viewing the page as somebody on a 2G network, or even, God forbid, even worse, that would basically give you the impression of how it's going to be on that device with that network. And it's pretty painful to see some sites and how they load, how they respond to slower devices and slower networks.
I also wanted to just take a second and kind of roll back when we were talking kind of about accessibility guidelines in terms of contrast. And these are all Googleable. And in fact, wherever you look, even in the WCAG, you're going to see guidelines for how to write alt tags. Many of us, even though many of us are probably familiar with the importance of adding skip links to navigation, but I want to stress that as programmatically testable as accessibility is, we can run it through a validator. Google Chrome or Google Developer Tools accessibility audit can validate for WCAGs or Section 508. This doesn't necessarily mean that the site is useful to users who have to use screen readers. We just performed fairly intensive usability studies with blind faculty, and found, surprisingly, that even though as a developer I have been conditioned to add skip links to my templates for years, this has been best practice for a long time, that when they encountered the skip link, it is something that they hadn't encountered before. They didn't know what the skip link meant, or the label skip link to navigation as read through the screen reader doesn't mean anything to them. Skip link to main content is somewhat meaningless if they're looking for a specific kind of content on a really long page. So it's so important to have real humans available to re-emphasize or point out the pain points in your supposedly functionally accessible website, because chances are it's not.
I couldn't agree more. The first time I was redoing our theme and trying to, make it meet just level A standards, I was all excited. I thought I had done a really, really good job. And then we have a a center on campus called the Paul Menton Center. It's a center for people with various disabilities. We had them take a look, run through it, and I was watching someone go through it, and what I thought was perfectly accessible and awesome just turned out to be, I think, almost even worse than it was before. I learned so much just from their feedback and watching a real person use it, as opposed to just, running it, like you said, running it through a tool and saying, hey, there's no errors. Okay, good, we're good to go.
Yeah, it should also be noted that while those tools, kind of what you guys are referencing, but while those tools can be helpful to identify some major issues, they're not without their problems themselves. About 6 or 7 years ago, while I was at my previous job, we had our state runs automated accessibility checks on all state-funded websites on an annual basis, and there was one particular institution that passed 100% passed through the accessibility tool. We failed like 98% or something like that because in our case, our search box was missing a label, and that was on every single page, so we failed. They passed, and their website layout was still built. I counted, and there were about 97 nested tables within each other, which is, when you try and get through those in a screen reader, you're just going to give up. But according to the accessibility checker, it passed. So, I mean, there are things where, again, like you guys are referencing, when you put them into real-world situations, just because it passed in the accessibility checker, which still, as Glenda Sims is famous for saying, those accessibility checkers only check about 5% of what you're actually supposed to be worrying about for accessibility anyway. But even then, those automated testers can have their faults on their own.
Mm-hmm.
All that said, now that we've made our testers sound not very helpful, let's talk. There are some, testing is a whole lot better than nothing, and so I figured we could talk about some different tools that we use and techniques that we use to kind of get through that first phase of testing. Because I wholeheartedly agree that there needs to be a human element in all of this. And but if anybody wants to talk about a specific tool that they use that helps with testing.
Yeah, I can start. I sort of go through, if you're just talking about scanners and tools, I have like a 3-step process that I sort of use. The first one I use is it's called HTML Code Sniffer. It's by Squiz Labs. It's just like a simple little JavaScript bookmarklet. It's super easy to just click on a bookmarklet and you get like a pretty quick preview. Doesn't catch everything, but it does capture, the bigger stuff, stuff that you may have just missed right away. Then I generally go to like A-Wave, or like the Wave checker, and then we also have a tool called Site Improve, which is a paid tool. It's fairly pricey, but it does a really good job. I find it finds a lot of stuff that the other ones don't. And then after we've done that, we send it for real world testing.
Yeah, I would. From our perspective, we use Site Improve as well, and it does a great job of identifying that low-hanging fruit. And like you said, typically once I find an issue with Site Improve, I'll go back and validate, kind of like with the web, the Wave, WebAIM toolbar or checker or things like that, just to see, because they'll give you different perspective on issues. Even if they identify the same issue, they'll give you kind of a different perspective on those things, and you can start to check into them and see what needs to be fixed and stuff like that. There's also a tool that I played with a little bit, but we haven't bought into the premium API yet. There's a tool for WordPress called Access Monitor that hooks into the Tenant.io API. And so directly within your dashboard within WordPress, you can run tests on your site or specific pages within your site, and it actually stores them as custom post types within your back end, so you can go back and refer to your previous reports. But from when we first installed it, Tenant.io had a free level on their API. I don't believe they do anymore, or if they do, we exceeded it. So we haven't yet bought into that API, but we're looking at it because it's definitely a nice feature to have.
Curtis, for that API, can the editors take advantage of that, or is that only for the developers and the administrators?
That's a good question. I don't know. I didn't really test it with editors, but because it's managed as a custom post type and things like that, if it's not something where out of the box you can grant editors access to run those tests, I'm sure that you could tweak capabilities really easily to do that. So.
Cool. Okay. So any more things we need to talk about accessibility?
I got chewed out a little bit by someone who I guess knows better, but I installed the Chromevox extension on Google Chrome. Apparently, it's not exactly comparable to something like JAWS 17 or any of the actual tools that people use, but it's interesting. What it'll do as soon as you enable it it'll make browsing the web incredibly annoying because it reads back everything from basically the address bar down. But what I found is that I'll enable that after I make a change to like a component or something, and I'll just tab through a page and see how difficult it is to navigate first by keyboard only, but also having the actual labels read back to you as a screen reader would. Very insightful. Like especially with like login forms. I don't know about you all, but we have some complex login forms. Like we've got like multiple boxes because we have multiple different kinds of users and so on. And while I guess like visually they are set apart by colors and spatially. Navigating that like as a screen reader, like, there's no indication that you're logging into one box or another. So hearing what the screen reader understands is incredibly insightful. Probably better if you actually have access to JAWS or a true blue screen reader, but Chromevox has been pretty valuable. It's just made the design process insightful.
Okay, so now just on the last note, we got about 3 minutes left. I just want to say I'm going to ask, what can designers do from the get-go? What can you do from the beginning before you actually get into coding? What kind of accessibility things can you do about? That's a high-level thing to be thinking about.
First thing I would mention, and this is somewhat selfish from my perspective since I am colorblind, is the designers have got to understand contrast and the contrast guidelines. I have gone back and forth with designers over and over and over again saying this is simply not readable, and they say, well, these are the colors that work on my color wheel, or these are the colors that are within our brand, and this is the only thing we're going to use. And so they've got to understand contrast and what accessible contrast means before they dive too deeply into setting out the color palettes and designing the layouts and things like that with those colors.
From a development point of view, I can recommend taking a look at the Web Experience Toolkit, which is an open source front-end framework led by the Canadian government, Go Canada, for, it says on their website, a front-end framework for building websites that are accessible, usable, interoperable, I can't read, mobile-friendly, and multilingual. It's a really good starting point, and if you know nothing about accessibility, just looking through the code can give you a really good idea of the types of things that you should be doing and the types of things that you should be looking for when making your own theme.
Something else that I just thought of while you were trying to read that was the fact that, and a lot of people don't think about this, but readability goes into accessibility as well. And so, there are certainly a lot of, there are folks out there who have reading impairments. There are folks out there that have processing impairments and things like that. And so making sure that your text is readable, especially for your audience, is an important part of accessibility as well.
I think you guys said everything that I would. For the developers out there, especially those who are fairly skilled, I would recommend revisiting what you think you know about HTML and just really know your markup. The quality of the markup goes a long way in terms of its accessibility, and some of the most advanced developers like I know their HTML really sucks, and just having have appropriate semantic tags will do a lot of the heavy lifting for you, not all of it, but significantly so. The new semantic HTML5 tags, which really aren't that new, have ARIA roles baked into them, and of course learning the ARIA extensions to elements will go a long way as well. But revisit and relearn. I guess it's only been not too long since browsers have all been able to parse that correctly, but the support is really good. So just double down on the basics, and it'll take you far.
Yeah, and I would add about that semantic markup that also helps you, in addition to helping your accessibility, it helps you future-proof your pages as well. So I mean, we're already seeing, Rachel probably has it on her arm right now. I don't know if anybody else does, but Apple Watches, they're going to consume content in an entirely different way than a desktop browser will. But if you're using semantic markup, you're already a huge portion of the way there to making sure that your content can be consumed on those other devices.
As the librarian on this panel, we could have an entire episode on schema.org microdata and microformats and all the amazing things that we can do to laden our web content with rich, machine-readable metadata.
All right, Rachel, do you have any closing words on your side from the person who just talked at Miami about accessibility?
I think I was actually sitting here looking through my slides to see if there was any good points. I will say that there are some checklists available. Some of these standards and things to keep in mind can get a little complicated looking. But WebAIM is a good resource, webaim.org, and they actually have some really nice simplified checklists that you can go down and read that help kind of point out these different areas. And the URL is long. I'm not going to read it out, but they are in my slides. If you can find me on Twitter, Bama Designer, if you have trouble finding those on their website. But I would recommend going and reading those checklists and kind of helping you form a general idea of the different kinds of accessibility, for lack of a better word, features or implementations that we're referring to.
All right, great. So that's it for today. Thanks, guys. Thanks, everybody, for joining on the Accessibility Talk. And we'll do this again next week with a new topic, maybe new people. We'll see what happens. We'll see who's interested and so on. So, anyways, thanks, guys.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.